I'm sitting with Uncle Ernie and Aunt Rosale and asking for a few memories of their time in Japan. So,
go ahead, Ernie.
Well,
as my honorable brother.
They're more recently.
But or let's start with, I mentioned that David wanted to hear just a little bit about Grandpa going to see Douglas MacArthur.
Okay. David Carlson?
Yes.
Okay. Yes. Douglas MacArthur's office was across from the Emperor's Moat, or Emperor and the Palace, and the moat around the palace. And he invited Grandpa to come a few times and to talk with him about the culture of the people, the best way to influence them against the nationalistic feelings, and in order to become, how would you say it, Ernie? Become...
how to treat the Japanese, how to come in and...
to be less, to be patriotic, but to be less nationalistic, to feel that the emperor was God.
Okay.
And he wanted our grandpa's opinion on how to do that.
And so Grandpa would go into was in General MacArthur's office?
In his private office.
Yeah. Is that...
I'm sorry that I'm so quiet, but I didn't have any connection with that
that part
of time.
Yeah.
But it was characteristic of Dad to be very reserved and humble.
Very humble.
And to respect the culture of the Japanese people.
Right.
And I think the purpose of General MacArthur probably was to show respect to the Japanese people, even though they had just been defeated in war.
Right.
But he did not want to do retributions. He wanted to start on a positive.
On a positive
note.
And you were working for what, the American in Tokyo, you and Rosale?
Okay, at first I was working for the Provost Marshal's office, which is the chief of police of the Army. And I worked for them for a couple of years, and that was just down the street from MacArthur's office too. And I would see his limousine come every day and turn the corner right at the place where I was working. And his wife would come into our office building. I was in charge of making passes that showed that Americans, what their role was in Japan. And she would come in and visit. She was a very friendly lady. And also his young son would come in.
Uh-huh.
And I guess I was very conscious when Chuck and I went to see MacArthur's office when we were over there a little over 25 years ago, and I was very conscious that my dad would go in to see MacArthur in the one simple suit he had, and he would talk with him in that one suit that he owned. And the Japanese pastors were rather surprised that he didn't have a change of clothes, because they thought Americans all had a lot of money at that time. And one of them said, "Carlson, why do you always wear the same suit?" And he said, "Well, because that's all I have." And that was a surprise to them.
And Grandpa was, from what I remember, he liked to have his shirts washed and ironed and stuff.
Very neat. I can just imagine that he took really good care of that suit.
Because somewhere I remember that it must have been, I thought it was Grandma, but she wasn't there at that point. But I thought I remember somebody saying that he would iron then his suit, and it would have a shiny ironing shine to it.
Could be.
When he went to the office. I remember that. And then there was the other story of Grandpa and the elevator when they, what was that story, just to have it here?
The pastor who was, I guess, the main pastor in the mission, Matsuda, at that time.
Yes, he was.
And he was like a member of our family for us. He was a very, very wonderful man. And they were to meet each other for the first time after the war. And Matsuda went to the Army dormitory where Dad was placed at first because the Japanese didn't have money to, and didn't have food to help him live at first. And they were both, I'm sure, kind of nervous about meeting each other at that time. And they went to the elevator to go up to, I imagine, to Grandpa's room. And Grandpa stepped aside for Pastor Matsuda to go in first, which meant so much to Pastor Matsuda because he was there, then aware that there was no feeling of victory or superiority by my dad over his love and friendship.
Yeah, that's great. And what we were talking about just a little in the kitchen, where were each of you born?
Florence, the eldest, was born in Takayama, which is a small, was at that time a small village in what's called the Japanese Alps, in the southern area, not too far from Osaka. And then Ruth was born in a fishing village in the Izu Peninsula, a little town called Ito. And then I was born 1921 in Tokyo, Japan. And then when we're on furlough several years later in Rapid City, Rosale was born.
So Grandpa Carlson, Grandpa Ernest, was born in Sweden. And then Mom, and the three of you were born in Japan. You were born in Rapid City.
And Grandpa was born where?
Chicago.
Yeah.
In Chicago. And then that's where Mom and Dad met.
That's right.
They were married in Chile, and the four of us boys were born in Chile. So, very world expanding. Okay. Well, good. Any other just memory?
I'll say one interesting thing. The school that I attended, high school, was in Japan, in Tokyo. It was very small. I was in a class of 7, and one of the 7 was a girl, a young lady named Beate Sirota. And when the occupation forces were there and writing the Japanese Constitution, she was one of the committee members that worked on the Japanese Constitution. And I guess her particular role was to do what she could for the status of Japanese women, that they not be considered subservient, but that they be equal. And she became rather famous, and documentaries were made of her. And we saw a documentary on the television here several years later about her. Her name was Beate Sirota.
Say that one more time.
Beata, Beata, Sirota, Sirota.
Beata Sorota. Okay, so let me end this.
Missionaries that went on that, and our dad was one of them. And he was housed by the military and fed by them because the Japanese had nothing. They had no homes, they had no food, nothing until they could rebuild. And so he lived in the military place for a while, and then he went to live with a Japanese woman who was a real clever businesswoman. I'll just say that much. Anyway, he met with this Japanese pastor when he first came back to Japan. The pastor was like an uncle to us, and us kids. And he met him at the billet, and they were going to take the elevator. Well, my dad just naturally stepped aside for Pastor Matsuda to go up the elevator first. And Matsuda knew then relations were good. My dad didn't think of himself as the victor because he stepped aside. My dad did it unconsciously. But from that, they still talk about that over 50 years later. The pastors, because Matsuda didn't have, and the pastor had no idea how my dad would receive them after the war, and that was their indication of how my dad felt.
Because he understood the culture.
And
he was being humble.
Yeah. See, in their culture, a conqueror would never step aside for a conquered.
Yeah.
And the fact that my grandpa stepped aside let him go into it was his nature. He wasn't doing it on purpose.
Yeah.
It was just his nature to step aside and let him go first. But just that instance made all the difference in how they saw him and his effectiveness, because they knew now that he was still coming as one of them. And Rosalie, just for the others to hear, you were working in Tokyo.
I was working with...
How old would you have been, roughly?
18.
18.
Yeah, and I worked for the Provost Marshal's office, which is the chief of police. They're the Army chief of police in Tokyo, and I took fingerprints of Americans and foreigners that were in Japan that needed special identification for privileges.
And that's where you said
MacArthur's wife
would come to Europe.
She would come in with her son, and she was just down to earth. She'd just talk with me or anybody else that was around. She didn't pretend to be somebody special. And I'd see her also in the PX, the Post Exchange, which was where the Army store, and she'd stop and talk to. I don't think she ever remembered me, but she just by nature did that too.
One more story about the suit.
Oh yeah,
okay. The grandpa would go into MacArthur's office.
You know, the Japanese pastors thought my dad was probably wealthy after being in America, and so when he was there in Japan, one of the pastors said to him one day, "Carlson, why do you always wear the same suit?" And Grandpa always made sure to have it ironed and pressed and clean and everything. Anyway, he said, "Well, that's because that's all I have is one suit." And they were so amazed that he cared that much about them, you know, and that he would be there without much in the line of clothes.
Now, Grandpa went alone to Tokyo first. Did he come back here, or did you and Grandma go back?
No, he came home, and we were home he was with us for a few years, and then we went back, maybe a couple years or so, and then we went back.
So when you went to Japan, when was your first time to go to Japan? You were born here. When was your first time to go to Japan?
Well, let's see. About 1933. when I was a couple of years old.
Yeah. Cool.